All right, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going to take historical data, mix it with some hard-hitting economic research, and build a literal balance sheet for the war on terror. We're tracking exactly where the money went. Here's our roadmap. We'll start with the trillion-dollar paradox, move into how a proxy war gets engineered, break down the war economy, dig into the hidden future costs, and finally, look at the legacy of debt. Let's kick things off with a number that's honestly hard to wrap your head around, $2.3 trillion. That's what one geopolitical analysis estimates the U.S. spent in Afghanistan between 2001 and 2021. But here's the wild paradox. Despite pouring all that treasure into the country, the intervention ultimately left Afghanistan impoverished and incredibly unstable.
Wait, it gets crazier. If you thought 2.3 trillion was a lot, a Harvard academic paper suggests the true total cost of the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts combined is going to land somewhere between $4 and $6 trillion. How? Well, that happens when you start factoring in the hidden long-term costs that, quite frankly, will be paying off for decades.
So the analysis we're looking at actually frames this whole situation using a very specific concept, schadenfreude. You might know it. It's that feeling of pleasure derived from someone else's misfortune. And they argue that the systemic ruin of one nation basically acted as a massive, lucrative profit center for another. It's a heavy, provocative way to look at it, but it's completely grounded in how the money actually flowed. All right, part one, engineering a proxy war. If we trace the timeline back, the decline is just shockingly fast. Get this. In the 1960s, Afghanistan had a genuinely stable economy, low inflation, and regional trade made up a solid 25% of its GDP. But then the Cold War heats up. By 1979, the Soviet Union invades, and the CIA responds by funneling something like $8 to $10 billion to armed groups through Pakistan. That one move essentially sparked decades of total chaos, leading straight into the Taliban takeover in '96 and eventually the 2001 U.S. invasion. Now, according to the sources, the absolute critical turning point wasn't just the invasion itself in 2001. It was the decision to take what was supposed to be a very rapid, targeted military objective and morph it into a 20-year occupation. That single fateful choice laid the entire groundwork for what became a permanent war economy. Moving on to Section 2, the war economy. Okay, this is where the numbers get really eye-opening. The research points out that roughly 60 to 70% of the money spent over there never even reached the Afghan people. So where did it go? Well, defense contractors saw absolutely record-breaking revenues. Lockheed Martin went from $25 billion in 2001 to over $65 billion by 2020. Or reconstruction, $145 billion spent, with a huge chunk of those projects left totally incomplete or they just failed. Here's a wild one. A single food supply firm pulled in $5.5 billion in just 6 years. And remember, this massive growth wasn't driven by some amazing new civilian tech innovation. It was driven purely by the continuous daily demands of conflict. And then you have logistics, which basically became its own gold rush. Because Afghanistan is completely landlocked, the cost-plus contracting model meant companies were essentially incentivized to spend massive amounts of money just to keep the war machine running. I mean, private contractors literally outnumbered U.S. troops. At the peak, we're talking 100,000 contractors to 90,000 troops. Delivering just one single gallon of fuel to a remote base, that could cost up to $300. Maintaining a single U.S. soldier averaged out to about $1 million a year. The analysis makes a really sharp point here. The system practically rewarded massive spending, inefficiencies, and delays way more than it rewarded actual strategic success. And if you want a final, staggering example of immediate waste, just think about the 2021 withdrawal. Roughly $7 billion worth of military equipment, we're talking helicopters, armored vehicles, advanced comm systems, was just left behind, simply abandoned. And of course, that was paid for entirely by U.S. taxpayers. All right, Section 3, the hidden future costs. So let's flip to the other side of the ledger. The really crucial point here is this massive widening gap between civilian and military healthcare costs. While private health insurance premiums for the average person were absolutely skyrocketing over the last decade, military TRICARE fees were kept artificially low. In fact, they even decreased in real terms. Naturally, what happens? Military TRICARE enrollment absolutely surged as eligible folks rushed to get away from those skyrocketing private costs. Because of that huge shift, combined with the incredibly heavy physical and mental toll of these ongoing grinding wars, the number of TRICARE claims basically doubled. By 2011, they had ballooned to an unbelievable 195 million claims processed in a single year. And the utilization of care is just profound. TRICARE recipients use roughly 30% more prescriptions per year than people in civilian HMOs. And it makes sense, right? The intense physical and psychological injuries sustained over multiple back-to-back deployments translate directly into a massive surge in complex, long-term medical needs. So what does the accrued bill look like for the next 40 years? Well, it's honestly pretty daunting. With 56% of returning troops currently using VA health services and half of them applying for permanent disability, the government has already committed to over $712 billion in future accrued care. That's not a guess, that is a legally binding financial promise extending decades into our future. Which brings us to Section 4, the legacy of debts. The Harvard data shows something really alarming. Medical costs are quite literally eating the future defense budget from the inside out. Under sequestration, the Department of Defense's medical spending is projected to jump from 8% to 18% of the total DoD budget. That severely shrinks the core military budget that's actually meant for defense capabilities. And here's what might be the single most critical financial decision of this entire era. The U.S. chose to fund these wars entirely through borrowing. That is completely unprecedented in modern U.S. history, and it dumped a massive $2 trillion directly onto the national debt by 2012 alone. So, what does this actually mean for us? It means future generations are inheriting an incredible burden. The U.S. has already paid out $260 billion just in interest on this war debt, and there are trillions more in interest projected for the future. The big takeaway here is that this borrowed money wasn't invested in things like U.S. capital or education or repairing our domestic infrastructure. Instead, it funded a foreign conflict that ultimately left chaos in its wake. And now that exact same debt is actively driving domestic austerity and budget cuts right here at home. When we finally step back and look at the whole picture, the sources present a stark, almost uncomfortably clear balance sheet. Over on the one side, we have immense, immediate financial windfalls for very specific corporate sectors, your defense contractors, your logistics firms, private military companies. But juxtaposed on the other side, we've got a multi-generational bill, one that's handed directly to the veterans who are going to need lifelong care and to everyday taxpayers who are now stuck carrying trillions in debt and interest payments. Which leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question to ponder about the financial architecture of modern conflict. What happens to global stability when war functions as a highly profitable business model rather than a genuine pursuit of lasting peace? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you a clearer, maybe slightly different view of the true balance sheet of war.